Okay, guys, this is part two of law of supply and demand. So we had learned that price is a reflection and interaction between the law of supply, which says to the supplier, the higher the price, the more I am willing to produce. The lower the price, the less I'm willing to produce, with its interaction with the law of demand, which says that as a consumer, the higher the price, the less I want or will purchase, the lower the price, the more that I want and will purchase. And that interaction is going to be leading us to price discovery, which is the most important thing to keep in mind when we're looking at supply and demand. So to continue, we have our demand curve drawn from left to right, our supply curve S0, and we know that demand and supply will shift. So we're going to look at different freezing a variable of supply. We're going to see what happens to price when there's some shifting going on. So we have price and we have the equilibrium. That's where market is in perfect balance. This is where we strive to be. This is maximum use of the limited resources and able to have maximum efficiency in the system. We are using every resource needed, and every resource that is needed is used up. So we have equilibrium. So you have these two prices on the supply curve and the demand curve, that if we're operating up here in either one of these situations at DP or SP, you are going to get this quantity demanded in the demand curve, or this quantity demanded or supplied in the supply curve. That is a surplus. So anything above the equilibrium point for either a supply reason or a demand reason is going to lead to a surplus. That's why margins exist, so that we can remove any surpluses through the system. That's why sales exist, to remove surplus. Down here, SP and DP at the supply price and the demand price. Below the equilibrium point, you quantity supplied, quantity demanded, you get into the shortage situation. So the supply is not able to meet the demand, or the demand is above that which is potentially being able to be supplied. You're going to get a shortage. So anything operating below the equilibrium point, you get into a shortage situation. That's what we're experiencing with masks and toilet paper and so on. The ability to produce plus an increased demand. People are buying way more toilet paper than they need, and the suppliers can't keep up. So you have a shortage. Demand now, we're going to now take a look and see what happens when we freeze one of the variables, supply. Supply will stay the same, and realize and remember that price is constantly changing, and the different consumers will buy at different price points and buy at different quantities. But if I can freeze the supply, what would happen if demand increases? So here we have P1, the equilibrium point, and demand has shifted. Because the demand has shifted from left to right up the supply curve, we have a new P2, which is a signal to the suppliers that they're willing to pay at P2. Suppliers saying, well, they're willing to pay more money than we will provide at Q2. You're still going to have a shortage. You're still going to have a mad dash, but it is a signal to the suppliers to produce more. So the system should react to that by producing more or attracting more suppliers into the supply chain. Now, demand decreases while supply stays the same. So here you have P1. This is the price, and that's the quantity demanded by people. And if demand was to shift, for whatever reason, people wanted that commodity less than after the COVID-19, after this pandemic, the demand for masks and the demand for toilet paper should return to normal or shift. And if it does, then what we will get is a shift in demand. It goes from right to left down the supply curve. You get a new P2, price, and a new quantity. This is the constant flux of demand. Now you can see the impact of how demand is just a signal to supply. It has nothing to do with supply. Demand in itself is what people want. And you cannot increase what people want unless you use advertising or other ways to stimulate that demand, but you can't just say, well, it's a supply issue. It's not necessarily the case. Now, factors that will shift demand are income. It's like if I have a certain set amount, I get paid a minimum wage, and we make the minimum wage $7.50 or $7.25, and then in Maine we make the income minimum wage $10, then $12, then $15. I'm increasing the income of each individual, so their demand will increase. Now, there's a difference here between demand and goods. A normal good is like something that is like a normal everyday brand name cereal. An inferior good is something that I used to replace that. So in Maine, we have the Hanover Brothers brand of Cheerios, or we have Cheerios. Now, if I have low income, I'm going to be buying the inferior good. But if I increase my income, demand for the inferior good will go down, because I can now afford to buy a brand name product. So demand will increase for the normal good and decrease for the inferior good. Price of related goods. Now, this is where you get into the substitutes and complements, frozen yogurt versus ice cream. If one of those is more expensive or less expensive, then I'll go to the substitute, or I'll go to complements, which is like strawberries and cream. I'm going to try to keep those related goods. That will impact how the demand of an individual goes. And the most important thing is taste and historical and psychological forces. Like, we spend an awful lot of time influencing how people will go about doing supply and demand. And historical and psychological forces is what advertising is all about. And when you have the influence on the internet, or think about music, what one person thinks one time is great music, as you change and as you grow or when you mature, your tastes shift, your demand in music also shifts, and what you once thought was popular is no longer popular. And the number of buyers is also impactful. So now we're going to look at supply decreases while demand stays the same. So we're talking about the red line. Sorry, supply is going to decrease. So it's going to shift P1, and it's going to shift to the left to the new price of P2. And then you can see quantity has decreased. So as supply decreases, there you should see an increase in price, right? The same thing will occur. Supply increases while demand stays the same. So P1, Q1, P2, new price, it shifts. This is increasing supply, so the demand curve has shifted to the right. So we have a new price. Notice that when you increase the supply, price drops in the quantity by adding so sometimes you'll see a new restaurant opens up, it's very, very popular, so then they really want to make themselves, so they're going to make more money, so they say, oh, we'll just increase our supply of our restaurants. They increase the supply of their restaurants, but it doesn't necessarily translate into more profits, and they eventually go out of business because they have not enough demand to support the two restaurants. You also start to get into, think about being a restaurateur. It's like you have so many tables, you have so many seats, and you want to maximize your supply by moving people in and out of those tables as fast as possible. So you want to make sure that you maximize your time at a table, but you don't want people just sitting there, because when they sit there, they're using a variable table. So they develop certain strategies to move their customers in and out. Factors that shift supply: input prices. Labor costs will shift supply. Raw materials, the cost of the raw materials that go into it, which is why we're studying commodities, because commodities are very important in determining the prices of everything. They are the raw materials that go into the production of all products. Technology will shift supply, and that will have a direct impact on labor. Technology can improve. The United States was the world's #1 oil producer during World War II. Then we seem to have used it all up, but now with fracking and new technology, we're able to replace and go into these old oil fields using new technology to increase the production of those fields. And now we're becoming one of the world's largest producers of oil once again. Expectations, natural conditions, and environmental conditions can shift supply. Just think about the global warming and how that is going to impact the demand or the supply of specific quantities or agricultural products. And the number of sellers determines supply. So here's some outside resources that you can look to at the end of the slideshow, which I'll post in the Google Classroom, and that is what we're going to use. We will be taking and explaining the law of supply and demand on our commodity project, and we will create 4 scenarios where supply stays the same, demand increases. What would be 5 things that could cause that to happen? Supply stays the same, demand decreases. What would be 5 factors that could cause that to occur? They don't have to be real. So if it was to be, so if a study came out and says that orange juice will cure a pandemic, will cure COVID-19, what would happen to the demand for orange juice? That's a scenario that would cause demand to increase. So we're going to be doing that for demand, and we're also going to be doing it for supply. Supply decreases, demand stays the same. Supply increases, demand stays the same. And what factors would be instrumental in making that happen? All right. And that concludes this short video lesson on the impact of shifting of supply and demand on price.